I'm very, very pleased to introduce Heba Aly, who has made all of this possible. She's the director of the New Humanitarian, and she's a journalist by training and has worked for over a decade in conflict zones around the world. She was a key part of IRIN's spin-off, the New Humanitarian, formerly IRIN News spin-off from the United Nations, and has really led this organization and brought it to what it is today. So I'm very pleased to welcome Heba on stage. She's also been recently recognized as one of the 100 most influential Africans in 2018, and also a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. So please join me in a warm welcome for Ms. Heba Aly.
Hello, everyone. You're live. Excellent. I should first say that, in fact, you're all here today because of Sarah's amazing efforts in leading us through what has been probably a much bigger process than you can ever imagine. So thanks again to Sarah and her team. As of this moment, the news organization that you have come to know and love for its dogged reporting on some of the worst humanitarian crises in the world shall no longer be known as IRIN News. So please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming to the world stage the New Humanitarian. Now, before we go any further, I have a favor to ask of you, because we would like for this new brand to have ripple effects around the world. So all of you, take out your phones and take a selfie with yourself, with the person next to you, and tweet, Facebook, whatever social media channel you want, that you are at the launch of IRIN's new brand, the New Humanitarian. You've got the handle on screen, and I'm going to do the same. Good? Excellent. Thank you. You are now part of our marketing team. So I know that many of you are actually quite nostalgic about the name IRIN, even if you don't know what it stands for. So allow me to look back on what is now nearly 25 years of coverage of some of the hardest problems the world has faced. Beautiful little logo. Let's go back to 1995. Kofi Annan was then the head of UN peacekeeping. OCHA, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, didn't even exist. And the Rwandan genocide had just shocked the world. And humanitarians that were working there at the time realized that they could have saved more lives if they had a better understanding of the crisis itself, if they had a better sense of where the needs really were, and if they knew who was doing what. So a few visionaries came up with this idea, and there is a fair bit of gossip and rumor about how it actually started. One story is that it was on a plane between missions, the other that it was scribbled onto a napkin at a bar. And how they came up with integrated regional information networks, as the name, is beyond me. But somehow they managed to take that sexy name and convince the UN to give them $500,000 to get this thing up and running, and IRIN was born. And, the first content that IRIN produced was these weekly roundups of aggregated news. And it was only really by fax machine that this stuff got out to the world. This was this was 1996, as you can see, a time before the technology of today. And it was only by accident that we started producing original content. And in 1996, a Christian youth leader from South Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo walked into our office in Nairobi and told our team at the time that his community, the Banyamulenge, felt under threat. Those tensions were the after effect of the genocide in Rwanda and turned out to be a trigger for full-scale rebellion. And the briefing that we published, based on his prompting, became one of the first comprehensive accounts of what would go on to become a civil war that, for all intents and purposes, continues until today. So that was 1996. We, a few years later, launched our first website at a time when most of the aid sector was still trying to figure out what email was. And so while it might not look very flashy by today's standards, this was avant-garde at the time. From there, and from that first story on the Congo, we would go on to open offices around the world, launch a radio service, a film unit, French translations, Arabic translations, even a mobile app. And we would spend the next 25 years bearing witness to world-changing events and the people whose lives they upended. Just as HIV and AIDS was becoming the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa, we created a specialist news service dedicated to covering the virus. When the conflict began in Darfur, we were one of the first news organizations to physically send a journalist into the region. The Aceh earthquake and tsunami of 2004, we were on the ground. Some of the lower profile crises, like the locust invasion of West Africa, which saw swarms of giant insects decimating entire countries, millions of crops, and leaving people hungry. When post-election violence erupted in Kenya in 2007, we were right there, very literally, in the middle of it. In 2008, we began reporting on what was then an unknown tension with a small ethnic minority group in Myanmar. And of course, you've all heard of them today. They are the Rohingya. But this was in 2008 that we began warning of the problems that lay ahead for this community. How about these guys? Boko Haram. Their rise was not when the Nigerian schoolgirls were kidnapped. This piece dates to 2009. Some of the two biggest issues on the global agenda today, climate change, is on everyone's lips, but 10 years ago, we were documenting its human impact. Migration to Europe did not begin in 2015, as the mainstream media might have you suggest. Back in 2012, we were documenting the cold response that migrants and refugees had on the front lines of Fortress Europe. There was the earthquake in Haiti, the floods in Pakistan, the famine in Somalia. When conflict broke out in Syria in 2012, the top UN official gave IRIN an exclusive interview in which he told us for the first time that civil war was on the way. And when the world finally started paying attention to the civilian impacts of the war in Syria, we tried to ensure that other conflicts wouldn't get forgotten in South Sudan and in the Central African Republic. When Ebola struck in 2014 in West Africa, I remember well that there were UN staff that refused to deploy because of the risks involved. And we were there with our journalist in a PPE suit reporting from inside the hot zone. Our world-leading coverage on Yemen cost our contributor his life. And he was so committed to telling the story of how the humanitarian crisis was destroying his country. But while all of this sounds very heavy, our coverage has had a few lighter moments, racy even. 50 Shades of Aid, humanitarian dating, was quite a hit. And this piece on the HIV risk of anal sex and how it was misunderstood by heterosexuals started with vaginal sex, thigh sex, even armpit sex. People have sex in a lot of ways. That isn't necessarily the award-winning work, but our work has been recognized around the world. It is presented at conferences. It is read in 190 countries and republished in newspapers, local and international. But most of all, it has had an impact in improving the lives of some of the most vulnerable people on Earth. And sometimes that's very personal. In 2006, our reporting on Liberia turned up in a refugee camp in Guinea, where teachers in a makeshift school were using it to teach Liberian refugees about their own history. And this story in 2010 of a young Yemeni girl who at 10 years old was married to an older man who beat her and drugged her, prompted readers from around the world to fork up $1,000 so that she could repay her dowry and get a divorce. But sometimes the impact is at the systems level. The piece we did exposing a hidden war in Congo-Brazzaville went on to become evidence used to submit a claim to the International Criminal Court. And some of our reporting that we have increasingly produced on the aid sector itself, and this story in particular, which exposed a massive UN corruption scandal in Uganda, prompted donors to pause their funding and demand an investigation and accountability. So 25 years of putting this kind of journalism to the service of the world's most vulnerable. I wasn't there when it started, but I can certainly say that's quite a legacy. So let's give that a round of applause. So with all of this cherished heritage, why would we change our name and our brand? In fact, it's long overdue. The planning for the spin-off of IRIN from the UN began almost exactly 5 years ago, and we have changed incredibly as an organization, both within the UN, but especially after we left the UN to become independent. We've changed to become punchier, to be more relevant, and to reflect the changing realities that we're seeing. Those realities range from the humanitarian needs themselves, which are changing, as you know. New threats like climate change are creating new drivers of humanitarian need. Conflicts are lasting longer and are much more decentralized. And the international mechanisms that used to be used to resolve international challenges are no longer working as multilateralism faces threat. The impacts of humanitarian crises are changing too, and having much more global repercussions. And the exodus of refugees from Syria is just one of many examples of that. And finally, the response to crises is changing. And we're seeing new approaches and new players emerging to fill an increasing gap between the needs and the response. Ordinary citizens were pulling refugees out of boats in Greece. Students have taken to the streets to protest climate change. Private sector technology like artificial intelligence is being used to forecast famine. And in the face of rabble-rousing nationalists and the rise of the right, people around the world are demonstrating solidarity with the most marginalized. Humanitarian action is no longer the exclusive domain of governments, of the UN, of big aid. In many ways, it's being democratized. And a new generation of humanitarians is reclaiming that term and demanding a seat at the table and a voice in the conversation. In fact, the whole conception of humanitarianism is changing. Disaster relief and aid delivery isn't enough anymore. Today, it's about addressing root causes. It's about long-term approaches. It's about building resilience to help communities be able to help themselves. It's about power and agency. And it's about imagining a better world. Our new name reflects this changing landscape, and the new humanitarian will examine what humanitarianism means in the modern era. And will seek to speak to that wider audience of global citizens who we call new humanitarians, who feel they have a stake and a responsibility in making this world slightly more humane. So I've gotten questions from a number of you. What about the old humanitarians, quote unquote? And I'd like to assure you that our mission remains the same. We are here to inform crisis prevention and response. So this rebrand is in no way a means to ignore you. It is an opportunity to build on that audience of decision makers and practitioners in the humanitarian sector and take the urgency of these issues to a much wider audience. Crises are here to stay, and the wider world can no longer afford to walk away. And it is the strength of that mission to use journalism to improve the way the world responds to crises that has gathered you here today. And I want to thank you very much for being here, because we would have never survived the many challenges we have faced as a nonprofit news organization in a media industry in crisis had it not been for many of you. We have an incredible team of people, and that is our staff, many of whom are here today, our board, many of whom are here today, and our freelance contributors around the world. But we're also here because of many of you, our readers and our donors, who have believed that this endeavor was worth pursuing, who have believed that the aid industry and the world needs this kind of news, and who have believed that people with an unfair lot in life deserve to be heard. And perhaps, most importantly, that we all believe that the world can be better than this. Thank you for the trust you have given us as your authoritative source on these critical issues of our time. Thank you very much. We take that responsibility seriously. The New Humanitarian stands for independence, it stands for courage, it stands for authenticity, and we take those values very seriously too. So I will leave it at that. Thank you for sharing this moment with us, and welcome once again to the New Humanitarian.